Compañeros, welcome to another edition of the SQL Data Partners Podcast. Welcome to episode 239. Today, we are going to jump into some of the SQL Server 2022 features, at least we think we are, and to start talking about the bi-directional HA to Azure, which I've also seen described as the new disaster recovery feature in the new version. So we have the whole team back, right? It's nice to be able to get together. And we've got Mr. Eugene Meininger.
Howdy.
And Mr. I can't make the regularly scheduled podcast time. So I'm going to make you guys meet earlier so I can do my training, Kevin Fiesel.
But Carlos,
I'm kind of a big deal, and I gotta move things around just for me.
It was nice that he could pencil us in. I think Carlos isn't bitter at all. It's fine.
Thank you for reminding me of my place in the world once again, Kevin. It is
it's in Richmond, so that tells you something.
It's what I'm here for.
Yeah.
It's actually in my contract.
Okay, so gentlemen, yes, it's nice to be with you and talking again. It's always fun.
Yeah.
Like it always feels like a long time between episodes now. So the show notes for today's episode are at SQLDataPartners.com/239. Because I'm not seeing a shortcut here. You'll just have to go there. And we do have a couple of shout outs for today. And the list is actually really long. So thank you, compañeros, for engaging with us.
Nice.
We've got Elizabeth Noble, Greg Knapp.
Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi, Elizabeth.
Gabrielle Bonotti, Brandon Park, Fabricio Calvalcente, Gina Marinak.
Hi, Gina.
Hi, Gina.
Mr. Dan Watson, the Dan Watson, I guess I should say. Even Trey Johnson sneaking in here. James Rote, our resident Florida man. Right. So anytime we refer to a Florida man, we're talking about James.
It's not a term of endearment usually, just to be clear. But
well, in this case, it is.
Yes, in this case, right. It's just like, usually it's synonymous with weird crime, often involving nudity.
Or alligators.
Yeah, or both. Most alligators don't wear clothes. I'm telling you now.
Man,
some of them do. Like the one on the Ninja Turtles does.
Our very own, or former, I guess I should say, our very own former Kara Zeigel, Andy Hawkins, Jake Bailey, Roderick Walker, all the way from Maryland. Hey, Roderick. We've got John Garman, Robert Glass, Sadia Douglas, Frano P. I don't know. That's I guess first name. I'm not sure who Frano is. And then Jean-Georges Prerine, who was on the
hey,
podcast. JG. Has gone to greener pastures. I did see from connecting with him on LinkedIn. So thanks to all you compañeros for connecting. We do appreciate it. And so with that, we didn't want to talk too much before, because I know we also have a bit of a time constraint today. The suggestion was made, was made by he who shall not be named. Hey, let's talk about HA or bi-directional HADR to Azure. They've started announcing new features in SQL Server 2022, rather. And that doesn't just come off the tongue, like the other ones. And we thought, let's start with that one. Now we started to swap notes. And my comment was, there's not a whole lot of notes out there, right? It's a whole lot of Bob Ward and trust me, this is going to be great.
Yeah, that's what they said about StretchDB, right?
Well, StretchDB was great until the final version came out, and they said, you got to use premium storage, which means that the data that you least care about, you pay the most for.
Sure.
Yeah. No, I mean,
the price for that feature was, I think the feature would have been nice. They just needed to crank down that dial a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. I think
3 orders of magnitude.
I think this feature has some promise, but I also think of the little we see, there's a couple gotchas. I mean, the biggest one is you notice in the demo that it's a distributed AG and he just fails over. Awesome. Right. And he's like, all right, we're gonna come back. So make a backup file and download it. Right? He doesn't, the switch is one way. You know what I mean? Like, it's suspicious that it's really easy to get into Azure.
All data
it's really
leads
difficult
to the cloud, Eugene. All data leads to the cloud. Right?
I know, right? So, yeah,
so,
I mean, good.
Minor step back, because actually that is pretty funny, and I think it's supposed to be reversible later on. That they're just kind of got it working one way first.
Right. That's fair.
But it is
so his
suspicious.
Defense, right? The demo was he was just trying to show that or indicate that I could take data from Azure SQL Data Warehouse or SQL Database, Azure SQL Managed Instance. Man, I'll get the right term. So Azure SQL Data Instance to back to on-premise. Did I not say it right? Kevin's looking at me.
No, you said data instance that last time. That's okay. So here's the rough idea for everyone at home who's like, what are these people talking about?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Thank you, Kevin, for setting the stage here. This is why, right? You're a little higher.
This is why I get paid more than Eugene. I get twice as many goldfish crackers.
It's probably for the best since I'm diabetic. Proceed with the description.
Yeah. So you may have seen the announcements for SQL Server 2022. The previews will be coming out at some point in hopefully the relatively near future. But one of the pieces of functionality they're calling bi-directional HADR to Azure SQL. Maybe that to Azure SQL, like Eugene was mentioning, is a little bit of what would I say, a ratchet effect. But the idea is, historically, all right, if I need to do disaster recovery, I can use availability groups. So I set up availability groups between two regions, and I would probably have asynchronous availability groups between data center 1, data center 2.
Right. Yeah.
And I don't want to do that synchronously because if I have any serious throughput in my SQL servers and I go over geographic distances like that, response times are going to suck for everybody. So let's not do that. So go back to SQL Server 2016, and you have this notion of a distributed availability group, which is even more remote. It's sort of like, let me throw the data at that other server and eventually it'll get it, I think.
Right.
So async availability groups still mostly intended for, I want those servers to be close to me, more of a high availability type of solution. Distributed availability groups, more of that, let's send that data off someplace. I need someone to pay a lot more money for log shipping, basically.
Well, but I was going to say that as well. In defense, however, it does provide slightly more tooling, slightly, right, being the key word, just that you can say like, hey, I am in sync or I am not in sync. Like I am working or I am not working. Whereas, with log shipping, you're kind of just like, well, did my restore happen? Right. And you just kind of,
No, I don't want to impugn the dignity and honor of the distributed availability group. Other people will do that much better than I can. But there are some other benefits. Like I could have a Linux-based node on the other end of that distributed availability group.
Sure, right.
Sure.
So I have that cross operating system movement, and I could do a distributed availability group as a mechanism for full upgrade. Like maybe I set up a distributed availability group for SQL Server 2019, and then I can have 2017 fail over to that and say, all right, congratulations, you're on 2019 now. It opened up some options. So what 2022 does is allows us to create a distributed availability group with Azure SQL Managed Instance, which is a lot easier to say when you've got the words right in front of you. So that's my secret.
Yes.
So you have this distributed availability group connected to that Azure SQL MI. And what that'll allow me to do is I could, in the event of a disaster on my data center, failover to use the distributed. So basically failover to Azure SQL Managed Instance and have that go live as this is my SQL instance. With Azure SQL Managed Instance, you get 95% of what you get on premises in SQL Server, maybe 92%, depends on how much quibbling you want to do.
Sure.
But most of the core data activities are going to happen the same way that they would on-prem.
Right. Yeah. Storing data, right? Getting data out, right? Those pieces are all going to work just fine.
Yep. Things like SQL agent jobs, most of the standard work. There's some things at the edges that won't work quite the same way or won't work at all. So this is something to keep in mind if you are using, for example, something like Polybase. Things won't work quite the same way to the extent that they work at all. ML services works a little differently. So suppose you have failed over to managed instance. This, in the prior days, would have been a one-way permanent, you're in managed instances for good, because how do I get a backup out of there? You could like build a backpack file.
Back. Yeah, or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's not like on-premises SQL Server where backup database to file, and now I can copy those backups, move them over to another server that's running SQL Server of the same version or later, and restore. What they've done is they're going to make SQL Server 2022 and Azure SQL Managed Instance sort of cross-compatible, meaning I could take a backup from Azure SQL Managed Instance, and it's going to work in SQL Server 2022. And that's where Eugene was talking about, where if I need to fail back, I failed over to the managed instance. How do I fail back? Today, there is no failback. It is basically take those backups from the managed instance, restore them on your SQL Server 2022 instance, and you could set the whole thing up again. Not a pretty experience, but right. I am hopeful that there will be failback capabilities built in by the time we get to a full release, because we've still got, it's only December of 2021. They've got 12 months to get this all pretty much.
Well, and it would make sense, right? Like I know in the past, geez, I'm gonna have the details wrong. You're gonna have them like on the top of your head, but I remember there was some like disaster recovery capability they had, and it was just like single direction replication. There was no way to get it back or something. I don't know if it was Azure SQL Database or something like that, but I am optimistic that you're right, that they're going to have it that you can fail both ways. And one of the things that's really exciting is the whole premise of the cloud is, okay, we can have this managed instance and we can have it running on cheapo mode theoretically, and then we fail over and we can just scale it up. Right? Because
I'm not sure there is a cheapo mode for managed SQL instance.
Probably not.
Because that's another question, right? Is that you don't quite get the same benefit. I mean, it's expensive. Unless they're going to tune that down or give you the failover option, right? It'll be interesting to see how that how that pricing works. But I'm sorry, I digress. Go ahead.
No, you're fine. I mean, the cheapest one that I see looking at right now is about $740 a month. Which is
okay. I feel like that has come down then, because I felt like the last time I looked, it was like 2,200.
Yeah, that's Generation 4 vCore, 20 gigs of RAM, $740 a month. Which, I mean, for disaster recovery to have something in standby, now that's standard storage. It looks like, but still, right. Yeah, even with premium storage, it's not terrible. It looks like $800 or $1,000 a month. So, I mean, I think. Again, I think it could work pretty well as kind of a cheap-ish standby, and then you scale it up the moment you have to disaster recover.
Well, now the other piece that I didn't quite get, and again, I don't see a lot of documentation out there just yet. Right. So in the current availability group scenario, I have a listener, right? I connect my applications to the listener. And the listener goes, go to server 1, go to server 2. Now again, he just kind of flew through that, like, oh, you just set it up and click, click, click. I didn't see that same idea And so while you can have it as a DR, to me, it still feels like, by the way, you're going to have to go and change your applications to now point, or there's going to have to have some kind of rerouting or, something, or your applications have to have both options in there, right? It's kind of like, we'll connect to one, and then if that fails, connect to the second one. Mm-hmm. Now, that's all speculation on my part. I don't have good answers there, but that's also something I feel like is going to have to get, I don't know, worked out, but at least explained a little bit better.
Based on what we know today about distributed availability groups, the underlying AGs have to have a listener. So distributed AG does require that the underlying availability groups have a listener. And the value associated normally would be like the underlying server name for a standalone instance. You would specify the configured listener for the distributed availability group as an endpoint URL when you create it. So going to managed instance, I would assume that you're going to have that same endpoint URL, but that I believe this will be configured for you. That's the other major benefit to using managed instance, that a lot of the underlying mechanics behind availability groups, which can be complicated. That's, you need full-time DBAs to manage availability groups because they are complicated beasts.
Right.
Distributed availability groups, also very complicated beasts. There's more stuff that can go wrong with the distributed availability group.
Right.
Especially when you start talking about different versions of SQL Server or different operating systems, and you're using Pacemaker on one side and Windows Server failover clusters on the other side. Having that stuff managed within Azure is going to make life a bit easier. So you don't have to manage the distributed availability group. You don't have to configure it. You can monitor it. You can ensure that things are going as expected, but you're not the one responsible for making sure all of the stuff is configured appropriately.
Right. Yeah, I do see that as being a benefit, and this will be interesting, which I think, again, is going to be, right. So setting up seems like it's going to be more approachable, right? Are there going to be issues when you have to fail over, or right when they're, and that's the other thing we didn't really see is the monitoring, sparse as it is. Admittedly, I'm not saying it's super robust, but how well are you going to be able to track some of those pieces, right? And in the event that you do decide to go, the low budget version, is it going to tell you, hey, I'm not keeping up? Right, I'm going to need some more. I need some more firepower here, for me to keep up or keep in sync with your, with what you're inputting here. I mean, obviously, it's going to vary, right? But how often you're writing, and if you're Aaron Hayes, and you're doing 1,000 transactions a second, that's very different from some of the other shops that we do that might do 1,000 an hour. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. And there are pain points today around the relative paucity of distributed availability group metrics and information. Tracy Baggiano does have some resources from her talk on availability groups that relate to distributed AGs and some of the pain that she's experienced. So you can experience slightly less of it. Yep. Aside from that, there's a little bit that's built in, and I'm hopeful that this move will really push Microsoft to improve the metrics that they're showing and improve the situation for what info you get.
Yeah.
Another benefit that you can get out of this is read scale out of your Azure SQL Managed Instance. And so you can have a readable distributed availability group, but it doesn't completely work as in distributed AGs today, where basically if you have availability group primary, I'm going to make Alan Hurts so mad if I continue with this. Availability group primary, which is in primary South Dakota. There we go.
Yep. Great town.
Yeah, it's a wonderful town. It's a beautiful town. This availability group maybe has Windows Server failover cluster, and it's synchronous. You can have read scale on all of the different nodes in that AG. You have a distributed availability group that is hosted in Tertiary, Arkansas, another great city. It's a much smaller town, but it's a great one. And we just skipped secondary altogether. So it's in Tertiary, and maybe it's hosted. It's got its own Windows Server failover cluster and several nodes in an AG in there. The way that read scale works today is that I can query from primary South Dakota and ask for data and potentially read from tertiary Arkansas's main, the primary replica of that node. But I can't read from the other replicas in that availability group when I'm using read scale. So that is by default how things work. If you use the listener to connect to that secondary availability group that's in tertiary Arkansas,
with the
then
read
you're
intent,
only
talking
going
about
to
read
get
intent here, right?
Yeah, exactly. Otherwise, you would have to configure each replica to allow all connections as a secondary replica and access them directly. So you're no longer going through the listener and asking, hey, can you give me a readable? Like you can with just a normal availability group where you'll get spread across the 7 different readable replicas.
All right.
So that may change, though. I guess we'll see. But when you're dealing with managed instances, you don't necessarily have to think about, well, what if I have 8 managed instances over on the other side, which you might think about on a distributed availability group, where on the other side I may have a whole AG of machines over there. So with that readable intent, I could go connect to a SQL managed instance and use that to offload my effort in primary South Dakota.
Yeah, read-only intent was something that I hadn't considered with this whole scenario, but that makes a lot of sense.
Well, so it doesn't quite work for Kevin's example, but I think another, which I don't think he explicitly said, but I'm going to, because it's distributed, right? We should have that. We should, the Azure managed instance should be readable, right? Which means that you're now in Azure services. So you could then, right, plug in whatever service here and start doing, Power BI obviously is a fairly approachable one, right? But I want to start doing some of these other pieces with it. Those become much closer, right? I feel like it'd be much easier to engage with some of those services than you have had in the past. So that should be interesting to see what happens. It's also
potentially.
It's also fair that we should bring up, again, I was talking about this with somebody this week, that so going to licenses, right? So Microsoft is trying to change licensing, and they would like to you to buy Azure services, right? That's what they want you to do. So even the new, now this is the word according to Carlos, right? So don't subject to change.
You don't have an NDA to break. You're good.
Yeah, that's right.
Just to be clear, I have absolutely no idea what Carlos is going to say.
Yeah, same.
And I definitely did not advise him on this or say anything about it. Just to be perfectly clear.
So,
and this is actually true. This is not like just to be clear, wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
Right.
No, I have no idea what he's going to say.
So it wouldn't surprise me if you could only lease, I'll use that word, SQL Server 2022 licenses, even if they're on premise, in terms of 1 year. So the idea of purchasing software like perpetual licenses is eventually going to end. It feels like, right? I mean, obviously some lawsuit or something might stop that, right? But if, Microsoft had their way, it's kind of like, hey, we want you to start renting your software. Because I think they want you to be on the latest and greatest. and they don't want to have the SQL 2000s out there forever, and somebody being like, hey, can you support me with this?
Well, except that's exactly what you get when you change licensing. This is why 2008 R2 is still around. This is why we can't have nice things. The last time they changed licensing, you had this major bifurcation where literally for a decade, a large number of companies said, we're not going to pay more money just to get SQL Server. This version works just fine.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. Also, I mean, you think about it, they've already tried that with software assurance. Like, isn't that the whole point of SA is that you're getting the latest version, you're paying on a yearly, every 3 year basis or whatever it is. And we're going to lock features behind software assurance to try and entice you. Like, if you want to use Power BI report server, you're going to pay one of two very expensive ways. You're either going to pay Enterprise Edition cores plus software assurance, or you're paying for Power BI Premium, which is like $5,000 per month, right? And so, they're already doing that, right? It's just a matter of how hard do they want to try and like put down the hammer.
Right.
And
but those are still new. Like, those are new services. So now trying to go backwards, like, and basically sell, like, hey, because at some point you're not going to be able to buy SQL Server 2016 or whatever, right?
Sure.
And then like, hey, you want to buy SQL Server? Here's what it costs for 1 year. Even if you're going to install it in your own environment. I could see that potentially happening. So it will be interesting to see, how
Sure. I'm just saying that, like, you could argue that software assurance is a trial balloon of that kind of approach, right?
I guess that's fair. Sure.
Especially with the same goals in mind of, hey, we'd like recurring money. And two, we'd like you on the newest version because it's going to be easier to support, right?
Right.
So it sounds a lot like mandatory software assurance is what I'm hearing from Carlos.
I would say the lawsuits would fly pretty fast in that scenario, because there's a difference between software assurance, which you get support, you get upgrades, you get additional functionality, versus you're buying
software
a product.
Obsolescence, software implosion. Yeah,
right. Like there's a difference, and there's a long-standing guarantee that you bought the product. You could buy SQL Server 2019, not have software assurance, just make a one-time purchase, you've got it.
Right.
Now, you're not going to be able to upgrade to 2022 without buying new licenses, but that's what we've seen historically. If you're not on SA, you go and buy the new version if you wish.
Right.
And they may try to change that, but for on-premises software installations, you could use a licensing model like that, but given the way the licensing model has worked, I think you get another 2008 R2 or 2012 scenario where a large number of companies will say, nah, I'm cool with 2019 for the next 15 years. And then you get no money from them versus some money from them.
Right.
Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see. I mean, well, then, so the unfortunate, which I guess we're tangenting now, but then unfortunately what happens is that then in whatever 2030, right, there's some virus that they finally find, for 2019, and then all those people that haven't upgraded, right, just get,
sure.
they become
I think, I mean, to me, what this whole move is about is less about trying to get like 1 year perpetual licenses and more about like, okay, we're hitting some of the limits of what we can do in terms of growing SQL, in terms of growing that licensing pool. Sure. But there's still a lot of space for getting people to use more of Azure, especially if you can provide a service that just, I mean, I know it's like an Apple thing, but it just works, right? Like if you can get it where I can say, create resource, create managed instance, I hook it up to my SQL and I have DR and it works, and I can point it at the SQL listener or whatever and test it and it works. Like that is a huge deal. Like having a DR site with a little dimmer knob is a big deal. Because I mean, DR is expensive.
Sure.
Having a meteorite insurance is expensive, so to speak. And so I can see that as a way to grow Azure services and to provide something that's meaningfully really useful to people.
Well, it is interesting because it is interesting to see what can influence things as well. Because we've actually had some conversations with some customers this week. The events in Kentucky, so the tornadoes that kind of went through Tennessee, Kentucky area, and they're unfortunately, which I don't know the details. I'm hearing this kind of secondhand. I haven't looked at it. But, so there was a factory in Kentucky that didn't know who was in the building, basically.
Oh, yeah.
So fire and rescue or whoever was there, right? They're like, well, how many people are we looking for? And they're like, we have no idea. And then there's all like these videos, I guess, surfaced of, they have their phones with them. And so they're on FaceTime or whatever. They're like, we're stuck, help us, and it was just it was a little bit of a nightmare, right? So now my customers I had a couple reach out to me. They're like, how do I get this reporting into the cloud, right? Like I always want to be able to know this information. And so, you just never know what's going to trigger somebody, right? To be like, okay, I want that,
Well, another thing related to that is like every 6 months I have like a midlife career crisis, and I talk to you and I'm like, oh, hey, what should I be studying? Should I like get my Azure DP cert? And you're like, no, all of the customers that we deal with are small, medium business, like they're barely using Azure, right? And so I can totally see this being kind of a honeypot lure to like get people to Azure for the like that dark mass of small, medium business that like everything's working. Why do I need to move to the cloud? And it's like, well, you could have a DR in the cloud. And it's like, okay, that's fine. And then like getting people more comfortable, because I feel like we're at the point in the adoption curve where it's a lot more of like getting those late adopters over now. I feel like most of the early adopters and a lot of that middle mass have started using the cloud. But I mean, when you talk small, medium business, that's still a meaningful group. At least every time I talk to you, you're like, no, keep doing Power BI. They like Power BI.
Yeah, that's true. And some not so small companies too, as well, right?
Sure.
So, yeah. Anyway, so it'll be interesting. So we will, obviously, I think this is a topic we'll revisit as more information becomes available.
When we can do a test run. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Well,
and actually, go beyond the demo that Bob smiles and winks at us an awful lot, during.
Yeah. Well, if we do like a quick thumbs up, thumbs down, I'm giving it a thumbs up. I think it's going to be promising. And if they can get bi-directional failover working, like it's going to be a no-brainer feature. 100%.
Yeah, whatever makes distributed availability groups better, I think is good in the long run, even if you don't use Azure, if you never use Azure, because at the very least, it's going to improve the distributed AG story.
Right. Yeah, that's fair, right? So some trickle down benefits, if you will, right? That you'll get as a result. So, no, awesome. Okay, well, good stuff. Thank you for suggesting that topic. Let's see. I guess we'll wrap it up there. So if folks want to circle back with us, how can they do so, Mr. Eugene?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at SQLgene, and occasionally I blog at SQLgene.com.
And Mr. Kevin?
So I failed over Twitter to Azure SQL Managed Instances, but I can't restore it back on my current instance. So
you haven't upgraded just yet, huh?
That's right.
And he's not on our shout out list, but he should. So he kind of poked fun at me because he reached out to me on LinkedIn, and he's like, well, I know this might take a minute because I said that I don't always engage on LinkedIn as soon as I get them. And so I feel like I need to give a shout out to Tom Marsden. So thank you for your patience, Tom. And for the rest of you who want to reach out to me, please do so on LinkedIn. I'm at Carlos L. Chacon. Thanks for tuning in for today's episode. Thanks, Kevin, for being here. And compañeros, we'll see you on the SQL Trail.
Bye.